Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Living in Switzerland. The series is brought to you by Rigby. We are a staffing and project services company based in Zurich. If you or anyone you know of is looking for a new role in Switzerland, or if you're looking to hire, let us know. We'd be happy to help. The best way to do that is by going to rigby.ch/apply and filling out the form. Then, if we have anything that might be of interest, we'll gladly let you know.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Expert Guide to Your Life in Switzerland. This is Daniel from Rigby, and in today's episode we'll be speaking with Veronica DeVore. Veronica is a Swiss-American dual national living in Bern and working as head of audience at Swissinfo. We'll be speaking with Veronica about her background, her experience of living here in Switzerland having grown up in the US, about the Swiss media landscape and about how certain stories in the news here may resonate with a global audience. So Veronica, welcome.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
So, could we begin by asking you to tell us a little bit about your background and what brought you here?
Sure. So I, as you said, am a Swiss-American dual citizen, and I was born in Zurich while my parents were living here. My mother's from Bern originally. But then quite quickly after that, I moved to the US where my dad is from and settled in there and grew up in Wisconsin, which is north of Illinois, south of Canada, sort of in the region of Chicago.
Right. And actually, your father's mother was also Swiss, right? So you have some Swiss roots on both sides.
I do. So 3 of my 4 grandparents are Swiss, and I once did one of those DNA tests you can send in to see your ancestry, and it was pretty boring in my case, mostly from Switzerland. And yes, my maternal grandmother married my grandfather, who was an American soldier, and moved to the US. So she came from Switzerland as well, in addition to my 2 grandparents who were living and working here in Bern.
I think that's quite an interesting story about how your paternal grandmother met your grandfather. Could you tell us that, please?
Yeah, sure. So it is quite a family legend. Well, it's true, but we tell it often in our family because it's so interesting, especially in today's times where we're connected so easily over the internet and everything else. But my grandfather was fighting in World War II, mostly in Austria. And then at the end of the war, the American soldiers, the GIs, came on a tour, some of them through Switzerland. And he was on that tour. And as part of it, they organized a dance or a ball, I guess, as they called it, at the Hotel Bellevue in Bern for all of these soldiers. And of course, they invited people from Bern to go. And my grandmother and her friend decided they wanted to go. And my grandparents met there. So they met, they danced once or twice, and they hit it off. And then my grandfather went back to the US. My grandmother stayed here. They kept up correspondence through letters. And eventually, she decided to marry him and go over to the US and settle there. And in the rest of her life, I think she came back to Switzerland maybe 2, at most 3 more times.
It's really an amazing story.
Yeah, it's quite a story.
But what about you? What brought you to Switzerland then?
So I had been living and working in the US, first in Wisconsin, as I said, then for a bit in Minnesota and Minneapolis, and then I moved to Washington, D.C. and worked there as a journalist for PBS, which is the public media outlet in the US. And then during all of that time, I was actually a Swissinfo reader because it's a service aimed at the international audience, also Swiss people living abroad. That was me.
Yeah.
So I was reading the platform, and at one point saw that they were advertising for a journalist position, and I decided to apply. It was always kind of in the back of my mind to, at some point, try living in Europe, try living in Switzerland, because I had the ability to do so. But I kind of knew, also given the high cost of living in Switzerland, I couldn't just kind of come and see what happened. I felt like I needed to have a job lined up, of course, and this was a really good opportunity. So I jumped at it, and here I am.
Okay. And one thing I think that might interest our listeners is how you and your family qualified to come over here. So you held on to your Swiss passport after having been born in Zurich, right, Veronica?
Yes. Yep. I was born with both citizenships.
But your husband is an American,
Yes,
so he had to apply for what's called the family reunification visa. Is that right?
exactly. So we were living together just outside of Washington, D.C. when we decided to make this move. It was all quite quite sudden. And then we also decided to get married quite quickly. So we planned our wedding in maybe a month. Of course, we'd been together for a long time at that point, so it was kind of natural and what we wanted to do anyway. But we planned it. We upped the timeline, let's say, so that he could join me here without much complication. And we're really happy we did it that way anyway. It was a lovely wedding and a great time. But then doing that allowed him to join me just a few months after I moved here on this family reunification visa.
Right. And with that visa, he can live and work here just fine, just like anybody else, right?
He can, exactly. So it's been 10 years now, but at first he came then on a B permit,
Hmm.
which some listeners may be familiar with. And then after, I think, 5 years, he could have applied for citizenship over the family facilitated naturalization, but
Hmm.
he didn't do it at that stage. He then instead upgraded to a C permit, which is permanent residency. So he has that now.
Right. And how was your experience of settling into life in Switzerland?
Yeah, so it was a bit bizarre at first because I would come here every summer to visit my family as a
Right.
kid. So that was my experience with the country. My
Hmm.
cousins and my aunts and uncles on my mom's side of the family all live here, and my grandmother did as well until she passed away. So we visited every summer for 4 to 6 weeks. I learned the language, Swiss German, as a child, so I knew it and I practiced it with my family. And so all of that, of course, really helped me when I moved here. I
Yeah.
felt not like an outsider completely, but I felt like I belonged in that sense. But there were other aspects where I really had to learn the ropes. I just clearly had never lived here before. I had only visited.
Yeah. There are some things that you just have to learn as you go along.
Exactly, exactly. So one example that I'm sure everybody has a story like this, I've come to learn, is regarding trash disposal. So
Right.
I was by myself the first few months. I was subletting an apartment from a student who was going traveling, and kind of on his way out the door, he said, "Oh, right, 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 trash. So, put it in these blue bags and then put it to the street, and then paper, something something about paper and bins and goodbye." And that was what I got from that conversation. And then in the US we just put all of our recycling material into one bin. So the paper,
Right.
the glass, the
Yes,
aluminum.
it's the same in the UK.
The same in the UK. Yeah, so a lot of
Hmm.
countries have this kind of one-stop system. And it came time for me to dispose of my paper, and I remembered this something about bins, and I thought, okay, so there are bins across the street and they have paper in them, so that must just be where we all put our paper. So I put mine in there, and of course, I think that night right away I get a knock on the
A
door,
knock at
and
the
there's
door.
an angry man there, very angry, who says, "I found your name on these papers, and how dare you put them in my business, the disposal for my business, and I could fine you," and all of this. And of course, with time, I learned the system. I read the Abfallhandbuch, the handbook. I found what I needed to know. But in that instance, I kind of realized, okay, uh, first of all, he was thrown by the fact that I spoke with him in Swiss German, and that
Hmm.
made him more angry, I think, because he thought, how could someone
Right.
who speaks
Exactly.
the language not know this? And second of all, I just thought, boy, have I made a mistake? Do I really fit in here? It kind of triggered all these feelings at the beginning. But, of course, that sorted itself out. And then the second kind of funny incident was I was shopping at Migros, had shopped there when I visited, of course, as a kid, as a young person, but never for alcohol.
Yeah.
And I needed some, or wanted some wine, I think, and went in and asked, couldn't find it, and asked one of the employees, "Well, where's your wine?" And of course, Migros doesn't carry alcohol, famously.
Right.
And she looked at me like I had landed on an alien spacecraft. Just why are you speaking to me in Bernese German, asking me where the wine is?
Right. That's
Yeah,
what makes that story so interesting, is because
exactly.
if a foreign person went there speaking English, then the staff would think, well, they don't know any better. But
Right.
you go there speaking Bernese Swiss German, accent free. That must have been quite confusing for them.
It was confusing all around, but once again, lesson learned.
And could you tell us a little bit about your role at Swissinfo and how Swissinfo operates?
Sure. So over the years, I've had 5 roles, I think, at Swissinfo. So many of those who work there, of course, the majority are journalists. So they're
Hmm.
working across the 10 languages that we serve. Actually, now 11. We have a small Ukrainian offering as well,
Hmm.
newly. But so I was working at the beginning as a journalist in the English department, writing news and features in English. And then later on, I became the deputy head of that department and then the head. And then I eventually transitioned to managing or helping to manage the organization as a whole. So all 10 languages. And since earlier this year, I've had a role called head of audience, and titles are hard. It's hard. People don't always know what they mean. But in this case, what it means is I work closely with the editor in chief, and we work together to ensure that the content that we produce is really meeting the members of our audience, our readers, the communities we serve, where they are. So they may be finding us, reading us on platforms other than our homepage, probably are. And that through various means that we have, that we're really hearing their questions, their needs, and understanding how we can best serve them.
Okay. And if I'm not mistaken, you're looking at the readership internationally, and you can spot patterns, right, Veronica, in the types of stories that people are reading in different places?
Exactly. So that's a big part of my job and our job is, we have data available in this
Hmm.
great internet age. We have a lot of data, from Google Analytics or from other analytics tools that show us where our traffic is coming from, how long people are spending with our content, and many other metrics as well. And one of the things that the data can tell us is, geographically, where are people reading what content or consuming what content.
Right.
And so that's, of course, very informative for us because we're aiming our content again at these 10 language regions. That covers a huge swath of the globe. So it potentially covers 80% of the world's population, the languages that we publish in.
Hmm.
But we want to know, more specifically, okay, what topics are resonating with people in Japan, for example, or in the Arabic speaking world, or elsewhere in Europe. And the data that we have access to, and that most or all media organizations have access to, can really help us to pinpoint that and again serve those readers better, understand
Right.
what they'd like to read more of, or where they may still have questions, or what they're particularly interested in knowing out of Switzerland.
Yeah. I think that's so interesting. And are there any insights that you could share about the topics that people are interested in based on geography?
Yeah, so one thing we've noticed that's quite interesting, I mentioned Japan earlier. So in that context, Japan has an aging population, as does much of the Western world, but in Japan, it's especially significant. And in part because of that, there's a really large interest around assisted suicide and end of life
Hmm.
topics. So Switzerland, of course, is one of actually few countries that allow assisted suicide, also allow so-called assisted suicide tourism, for lack of a better term, people who come here for that service.
Yep.
And so there's a great deal of interest in that in Japan. And we have a feature on Swissinfo where we enable readers to debate or exchange on a topic with each other and with our journalists. So
Hmm.
we'll pose a question, a journalist who's covered a topic in depth will pose a question to our readership, and then a sort of discussion ensues about that across all 10 languages. So there's a
Right.
feature that allows for the auto translation of everyone's answers so that they can really discuss with each other across languages. So our most popular so-called debate in this format for months and months has been on this question of assisted suicide, which, is a controversial question. How should the end of life look? What options should be available? And this clearly resonated with our readers, especially in Japan. And this debate continues to be popular, continues to be read. People continue to participate, not just in Japan, but around the world. And that's really shown us how important it is that we keep covering this topic from Switzerland, where the conversation around it, I think, is unique in the world.
Sure.
And there's a couple other examples of some topics that resonate in different parts of the world. For example, in the Arabic-speaking world, the opposite is true of Japan. The population is generally quite young. A lot of young people. They're thinking about their education, their career, their future prospects. And so, for example, we cover the Swiss vocational training system quite a bit. This is, where young people can leave secondary school, and instead of going to university, they can pursue education in a trade or do an apprenticeship to learn a skill rather than going to university. So there's a great deal of interest in that, and in other places too, but particularly in the Arabic-speaking world, where, as I said, there are a lot of young people. They're thinking about options available to them. Options in other parts of the world are sort of generally interested in these topics. And then finally, one of our key groups that we target with our content that we serve is the Swiss people living abroad. There are nearly 800,000 of them, so it's essentially a tenth of the Swiss population. They can also vote for life, so they're a very significant voting bloc, and they've even, if you take into account their votes, they've swung elections, or rather referendums, on some key topics over the years. And we can see geographically, for example, there's a large Swiss abroad population living in France, around Lyon. There are large populations in the United States, as well as some parts of South America, Argentina, Brazil. And so we really aim to serve them with the topics that they've told us that they are following, particularly around banking. Can they have access to a bank account in Switzerland? E-voting, what's the best way for them to participate in elections and referendums? And of course, they follow what is happening in the political conversation in Switzerland as well.
Right. And with the tool that you're using, a user can read and respond to a thread in their own language.
Exactly. So when it comes to this debate product or this debate platform that I mentioned, it's exactly that. So we could pose a question to all of our 10 language audiences around assisted suicide, for example, or other topics, political topics, and the readers can read that question in their own language and respond in their own language. But then if you read and respond in English, for example, somebody else can look at that question and your response in Italian, in auto translation, and also respond to you in Italian, and then you can in turn read it in English. So this is kind of the way that it works, allowing for this cross-linguistic or cross-cultural exchange.
There's a few cool tools that you've been working on. Another, I think, is SWIplus. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So SWIplus is an app that we launched fairly recently, within the last several years, currently available in German, English, Italian, and French. So you can find it in the App Store, and it's aimed at the Swiss population living abroad. As I mentioned, that's a big target group for us. We do a lot with and for those readers. But what it offers is a daily briefing from one of our journalists. So the journalist is following the news out of Switzerland that day. They write a little sort of digest of what they're watching and what the most important stories of the day are. And that goes out in the app at, I believe it's 5 p.m. Swiss time every day. And then in addition to that, the app offers access to these debates, which I mentioned, and a host of other resources as well, all revolving around Switzerland and news and information out of Switzerland, and kind of keeping in touch with Switzerland.
You've worked in the media in 2 different countries. Is there anything about the Swiss media landscape and how it works that you've noticed which might be slightly different from that of other countries?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I've worked in public media, so
Right, PBS.
publicly funded media organizations in both the U.S. and Switzerland. And so there, I've noticed some interesting kind of differences about how the landscapes are and what organizations exist and how big of a presence that public media is in both of these markets. And in Switzerland, it's a very significant presence. So there's a really high quality offering across basically 5 units. So there are 4 units within the country that serve the German, French, Romansh, and Italian speaking populations. And then, of course, Swissinfo is the 5th unit, and we serve the rest of the world, essentially. So we're the international service. And as listeners will know, the formerly known as BILAG license fee, now known as Serafe, that's a fee, or I guess some might call it a tax, that's paid by every household in order to support this public media system. And that model doesn't exist in the US. It's, their public media is a much smaller piece of the media puzzle, and there's no funding to that degree of it. So because that funding doesn't exist, it is a voice in the ecosystem, but it's a much smaller voice. There's a lot more happening in the private space. That's kind of a key difference that I noticed coming here, was just the presence, the quality of public media. And I was fascinated to learn that the offering, radio, TV, online, by law is mandated to be equal for the citizens speaking all of these languages, because Switzerland has four languages, 4 official languages.
Right.
And so that, is why it takes so much to keep this public media offering running, because you essentially have to finance it, times 4 within the country, and then plus Swissinfo, which we don't have the broadcast piece. We're much, much smaller, but we do have the online offering.
And you mentioned there the Serafe license, what used to be known as the BILAG license. I think that's something that people pay without knowing exactly what it goes to funding. Could you say a few words about that?
Sure. So it funds the information service of all 5 of the Swiss Broadcasting Corporation units. So that's the German-speaking, which is SRF, the French-speaking, which is RTS, Italian is RSI, and the Romansh is RTR out of Chur. And all 4 of those units are mandated with informing the public over various channels on news, any issues of significance within the country, weather service, all of these things important to sort of daily life and information needs. There's also local coverage within that, and they have an extensive network of correspondents and people reporting throughout Switzerland to contribute to that offering. And then, as I said, Swissinfo is also partially funded by the license fee, and then partially directly by government mandate.
Right.
And but we're also part of that network, and we are the international service of the Swiss broadcasters. So that's the bulk of what it funds, but some of the funding from Serafe money also goes to private media. It's not just the Swiss Broadcasting Corporation, and that's in the interest of upholding the diversity of the Swiss media landscape, ensuring that there is a diverse landscape. As we know, in many countries throughout the world, including Switzerland, there are much fewer media sources now than there were in the past. It continues to be a struggling industry to a large degree. So some of this funding also goes to private media in the interest of that diversity and upholding and supporting the sector as a whole.
And one of the big long-running stories, if not the big long-running story of the last few years, was, of course, COVID. Was there anything about that story and how it was reported here that you think might be particular to Switzerland?
Yes. So this was probably the big long-running story of our lifetimes, I would say.
Sure.
Not just here, but in the whole world. But I think some particularities in Switzerland, one of them is that Switzerland has a direct democracy. And so, of course, the federal government needed special permission through a special COVID law, as we called it, to be able to take the measures that they needed to take in order to stem the pandemic or address the pandemic. And at some point, that law was put to a vote through the direct democracy system. And that's quite unique to Switzerland, I think, the ability to do that. And then, of course, the conversations, the political back and forth and controversy also around the law and whether the government really had the mandate to do this. That conversation, I think, was quite unique here. And also the fact that the law was voted on, I believe it was last November. So we were already quite deep into the pandemic when the vote came. That's also down to the system that, first the signatures have to be gathered and everything has to be rubber stamped and the vote has to be prepared. So of course it wasn't possible to vote on it kind of the day after it took effect, but in some ways that also gave it some time to show the effects and for people to weigh both sides of the issue. So that I think was quite particular to Switzerland, the nature of how we weighed in on the measures being taken by the government. And then when it came to vaccines and whether people should get vaccinated and that discussion there, of course, here, like in many other countries, there were heated discussions about that. There was polarization around that topic, a lot of controversy, a lot of personal struggles, I'm sure, in families and people at different sides of the issue. But Switzerland, interestingly, has quite a long history with vaccine skepticism and this question of whether to vaccinate, especially children. And even well before the pandemic, in 2019, a colleague of mine looked at this issue in depth for Swissinfo. And she looked at sort of the various societal movements that led to vaccine skepticism in Switzerland. And she also talked to a professor who'd participated in a big study looking at vaccine skeptical patients and doctors in Switzerland. And he pointed out that wealthy societies like Switzerland often have a higher level of skepticism in this regard because there's a higher degree of personalized medicine. So perhaps in less wealthy societies where everyone just kind of gets the same standard of care, whatever that may be, in Switzerland, there's really this variation in personalized advice from different physicians, different-minded physicians, and that phenomenon in Switzerland leads to, or has led to historically, this higher degree of skepticism.
And are there any tips that you would share with someone making the move to Switzerland now?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think Switzerland often is cast as a place where maybe integrating is a little bit difficult, or it can be, somewhat daunting, I think, for people just moving to the country to find their way. And part of that, I think, is the close-knit communities that there are here, also the linguistic communities with the different German dialects. And it's really challenging, I think, to navigate all of that as a newcomer. But I would just encourage people to really have an open mind and be aware that there is a way forward, and that the Swiss, are welcoming, and that there is a place for everyone here.
Sure.
It's something that I experienced myself, kind of straddling these two worlds or these two backgrounds, and I found it really important these last 10 years to also try to bring people into the fold myself and work a little bit against this stereotype that Switzerland is unwelcoming or somehow especially hard to integrate into, because I think you kind of get out what you put into it, and at least that's what I found. And I think, if the willingness is there to really try to meet people and share your own experience and where you're coming from, there's a great deal of openness and curiosity about other parts of the world, this cross-cultural debate. And for that, I think it's really a wonderful place with people who come from everywhere.
Mm-hmm. And if you can spare one newcomer the experience of having an angry neighbor shout at them about recycling, it will all have been worth it.
I hope so. My main tip there is read your Abfallkalender in German, which is the trash or garbage calendar, which
you can subscribe to it.
You can subscribe to it. I think there's even an app,
there is
website,
an app.
And you get it sent home. So it's actually quite incredible, the whole thing. But you have to know about it first. So there's your tip.
Veronica, I could talk to you all day. So thank you so much for joining us. This is really interesting.
Thank you for having me. It's really been a pleasure.
And thanks to you for listening. We'll include links in the show notes to our guest and to further materials about some of the topics that we've spoken about today. If you enjoyed the episode, please leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. Once again, this podcast was brought to you by Rigby. We're a staffing and project services company here in Zurich. If you would like our help either to hire or to be hired, let us know. Best way to do that is by going to rigby.ch/apply and filling out the form. You can also sign up for our newsletter at rigby.ch/newsletter to receive our Living in Switzerland guide. We'll send you one email per month about expat-focused news and jobs in Switzerland. So thanks, and until the next time.